When my son suggested installing a medical alert system after my fall last spring, I thought it was the sweetest gesture. At 72, living alone in the house where I'd raised 3 children, I'd become fiercely independent, maybe too independent according to my daughter Claire. The fall had been minor, just a slip on wet tiles in the bathroom, but it had scared everyone enough that when Daniel showed up with the sleek white device and that earnest look on his face, I didn't have the heart to refuse. I never imagined that act of supposed love would become the weapon he'd use to destroy everything I'd worked for my entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Walsh, and I've lived in the same house in Oakmont for 47 years. My late husband Thomas and I bought this place when Daniel was just 2 years old, back when the neighborhood was full of young families and the streets were lined with tricycles and laughter. Thomas passed away 6 years ago from complications related to Parkinson's disease, and I've been managing on my own ever since. Managing quite well, actually, despite what my children seem to think. The medical alert system arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. Daniel came over with his usual efficiency, the kind he'd inherited from his father, carrying the box like it contained something precious. He was 48 now, my oldest child, with graying temples and the kind of successful career in pharmaceutical sales that meant he wore expensive suits and drove a car that cost more than my first house. His wife Patricia rarely accompanied him on these visits anymore, claiming she was too busy with her charity committees and country club obligations. "Mom, this is top of the line," he said, unpacking the components on my kitchen table. "It's not just a pendant you wear around your neck. It has fall detection, automatic alerts, and even a speaker system so you can talk to the monitoring service from anywhere in the house. They can hear you even if you're in another room." I peered at the small white box with its blinking green light. It seemed overly complicated for what I needed, but Daniel was so insistent, so genuinely concerned, that I found myself nodding along as he explained all the features. The pendant itself was surprisingly lightweight, a small white disc that hung on a silver chain. It looked almost elegant, not like the bulky emergency buttons I'd seen other elderly people wear. "The monitoring service is based right here in Colorado," Daniel continued, pulling out paperwork for me to sign. "They're available around the clock. If you fall or press the button, they'll contact emergency services immediately. And Mom, I've listed myself as the primary contact. They'll call me first if anything happens." "That makes sense," I agreed, signing the papers without reading them too carefully. Daniel had always been the responsible one, the child who'd stepped up after Thomas died to help manage things I found overwhelming. Financial decisions, insurance claims, even getting my roof repaired last summer. He'd handled it all with a competence that made me grateful, even if it sometimes felt like he was taking over more than necessary. After he installed the system and tested it, making me press the button so he could hear the monitoring service respond through the speaker, Daniel stayed for dinner. I made his favorite pot roast, the one I'd been making since he was a boy, and we sat at the kitchen table talking about his work, his 2 teenage sons, the upcoming summer plans. It felt normal, comfortable, the way things had always been between us. "I love you, Mom," he said as he was leaving, kissing my forehead the way Thomas used to. "I just want to make sure you're safe." 2 weeks after the medical alert system was installed, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was from Sandra Chun, an attorney I'd never heard of before, calling about a matter she described as sensitive and requiring immediate attention. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm calling regarding your property at 15 Oak Ridge Lane in Oakmont. There's been some activity with the deed that requires your attention." "I don't understand," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "What kind of activity?" "That's what I'd like to discuss with you in person. Would you be available to come to my office this week?" I could hear something in her voice, a careful neutrality that suggested bad news delivered professionally. The kind of tone doctors use when test results come back abnormal. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon. I didn't mention the call to anyone, not even to Claire, my daughter, who lived just 20 minutes away and called me every other day. Something about Sandra Chen's tone made me want to understand what was happening before involving my children. At my age, you learn to trust your instincts about when something is very wrong. Sandra Chen's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel, that made me feel out of place in my simple cardigan and slacks. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. Her office was neat, organized, with diplomas from impressive universities on the wall. "Mrs. Walsh, thank you for coming in," she began, gesturing for me to sit in a comfortable leather chair across from her desk. "I'm going to be direct with you because I believe that's what you deserve. 2 months ago, a quitclaim deed was filed transferring ownership of your property from you to your son Daniel Walsh. Did you authorize this transfer?" The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. Transfer ownership? No, of course not. The house is mine. My husband and I bought it in 1977. Sandra slid a document across her desk. "This is a copy of the quitclaim deed. It bears your signature and was notarized on January 15th of this year. Do you remember signing this document?" I looked at the paper, at the signature that did look remarkably like mine, at the notary stamp and official seals. January 15th. I'd been at Daniel's house that day for his younger son's birthday party. He'd asked me to sign some papers, something about updating my will or healthcare directives. I'd signed several documents that afternoon, trusting that Daniel was helping me get my affairs in order the way he always did. I might have signed something, I admitted slowly, but Daniel told me it was about my will. He said he wanted to make sure everything was organized in case something happened to me. Sandra's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Sympathy maybe, or anger on my behalf. "Mrs. Walsh, this document transfers full ownership of your home to your son. You no longer legally own the property where you've lived for 47 years. As of this filing, Daniel Walsh is the sole owner." The office suddenly felt too small, too airless. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to steady myself against a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with my age or health. "That's not possible. Daniel wouldn't do that. He's my son. He's been helping me manage things since Thomas died." "I understand this is shocking," Sandra said gently. "That's why I wanted to meet with you in person. I specialize in elder law, and unfortunately I see cases like this more often than you might think. Adult children who take advantage of their parents' trust, who use positions of authority to transfer assets without full disclosure. But why would you be looking into this? How did you even know to contact me?" Sandra leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "I received an anonymous tip about the deed transfer. Someone who was concerned about the circumstances surrounding it. I did some preliminary investigation and found several red flags. The timing, the type of document used, the fact that you continued living in the house as if nothing had changed. It suggested you might not have understood what you were signing." "Who sent you the tip?" "I don't know. It came through a secure email system that protects the sender's identity. But Mrs. Walsh, right now that's not as important as figuring out what you want to do about this situation. We have several options, but time is critical." I sat in that office for 2 hours while Sandra explained the legal implications of what Daniel had done, how a quitclaim deed worked, how it was often used in fraud cases because it required no disclosure about the property's condition or any existing interests, how Daniel now had the legal right to sell the house, refinance it, even evict me if he chose to, how fighting this would require proving I'd been deceived, that I hadn't understood what I was signing, that Daniel had abused a position of trust. The worst part was understanding how vulnerable I'd become. At 72 I was competent, sharp, capable of managing my own life. But I trusted my son completely. I'd signed documents without reading them carefully because I believed he was protecting me, not stealing from me. That trust, Sandra explained, was exactly what made cases like mine so difficult to prove, and so devastating when they succeeded. "I need to think about this," I said finally, gathering my purse with shaking hands. "I need to talk to Daniel to understand why he would do this. Mrs. Walsh, I strongly advise against confronting him directly before we have a legal strategy in place. If he knows you're aware of the transfer, he might take steps to protect the asset. He could sell the house quickly, transfer it again, create complications that make recovery much more difficult. But he's my son. There has to be an explanation. Some misunderstanding that we can clear up." Sandra's expression was kind but firm. "In my experience, when adult children transfer property this way, it's rarely a misunderstanding. But if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least wait until we've taken some protective legal measures. Let me file a lease pendens, a notice that there's a legal challenge pending. That will prevent him from selling or refinancing until we resolve this. I agreed, though every instinct in me wanted to believe there'd been some terrible mistake. Daniel couldn't have stolen my house. The boy I'd raised, who'd held my hand at his father's funeral, who called me every week and brought his sons to visit, he couldn't be capable of such calculated cruelty. There had to be another explanation. That night I sat in my living room, in the house that apparently no longer belonged to me, trying to understand how my life had come to this. The medical alert pendant hung around my neck, its small weight a reminder of Daniel's supposed concern for my safety. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd given me a device to protect me from physical harm, while systematically working to take away the home that represented my security, my independence, my entire adult life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went through every document I'd signed in the past year.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Every piece of paper Daniel had brought for my signature. There were more than I'd realized. Updates to my power of attorney, changes to bank account access, documents about refinancing the house that Daniel said would lower my property taxes. Each signature had seemed reasonable at the time. Each document explained in Daniel's confident voice as being for my own good, to make my life easier, to protect me. Now I saw them all differently. Not as protection but as a carefully constructed trap. The next morning, I called Sandra-chan and told her to file whatever legal documents were necessary. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called Claire, my middle child, and asked her to come over immediately without telling anyone where she was going. Claire arrived within an hour, concern written all over her face. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you sick? Did something happen?" "Sit down, sweetheart," I said, leading her to the kitchen table. "I need to tell you something about your brother, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I'm finished." I told her everything. The phone call from Sandra-chan, the quitclaim deed, the signatures I'd given without understanding what they meant. I watched Claire's face change from confusion to disbelief to a rage so pure it reminded me of her father when someone had wronged his family. "That son of a bitch," she said when I'd finished, her voice shaking. "That absolute son of a bitch. Mom, have you confronted him? Does he know you found out?" "Not yet. My lawyer advised me to wait, to build a case first. But Claire, I need to know if you've seen anything, heard anything that might explain why Daniel would do this." Claire was quiet for a long moment, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "Mom, I didn't want to say anything because I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe I was being paranoid. But Patricia, Daniel's wife, she's been posting on social media about a vacation home they're buying. Some luxury condo in Vail. She's been showing interior design options, talking about mountain views. I thought maybe Daniel had gotten a huge bonus at work, but the timing, Mom. The timing matches exactly with when he had you sign those papers." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Daniel hadn't just stolen my house on a whim. He'd done it to fund a lifestyle upgrade, a vacation property for his family. My home, the house where I'd raised him and his siblings, where his father had died, where every room held memories of our life together, it was being converted into cash for a ski condo. "There's something else," Claire continued hesitantly. "Last month when I stopped by Daniel's house to drop off a birthday present for the boys, I overheard him on the phone in his study. He didn't know I was there. He was talking about selling a property in Oakmont, about how the market was hot and he could get well above asking price. Mom, I think he's planning to sell your house." The betrayal was complete. Not only had Daniel stolen my property, he was actively planning to sell it, to displace me from my home of 47 years so he could profit from my trust. And he'd done it all while pretending to be the devoted son, the one who cared about my safety and well-being. "I need to install a recording app on my phone," I said suddenly. "If Daniel calls, if he comes over and we discuss this, I want proof of what he says." Claire looked at me with new respect. "Mom, that's smart. But we need to be careful. If he finds out you're recording him, if he realizes you know what he did, he might accelerate whatever plans he has." We spent the rest of that afternoon planning. Claire helped me install a recording application on my smartphone, showing me how to activate it with a simple tap. We discussed strategy, when to confront Daniel, how to protect my interests, and we called Michael, my youngest child, to tell him what his older brother had done. Michael's response was immediate and furious. He'd always been the most protective of the three, the one who'd stayed closest to home, who visited most often. Learning that Daniel had betrayed me while he'd been trying to help me with yard work and home repairs, it ignited something fierce in him. "Mom, I'm coming over tomorrow," Michael said over the phone. "And I'm bringing some equipment. If Daniel's been this calculated about stealing your house, I want to know what else he's been planning. That medical alert system he installed, I never trusted it. Those things can be used for surveillance if someone knows what they're doing." His words sent a chill through me. The medical alert system with its sensitive microphones that could pick up conversations from anywhere in the house. The device Daniel had insisted was top of the line, necessary for my safety. Could he have been using it to listen to my private conversations? To monitor my activities? To gather information he could use against me? That night, I looked at the small white box mounted on my kitchen wall with new eyes. The steady green light that I'd found comforting now seemed sinister. I thought about all the phone calls I'd made from this kitchen, all the conversations I'd had with Claire about her concerns, with Michael about family matters. Had Daniel been listening to all of it? I walked to the device and examined it closely for the first time since installation. There was a small logo on the bottom, Secure Life Alert Systems. I took a photo of it with my phone and sent it to Michael with a simple message. "Check this company out. See if Daniel has any connection to it." His response came back within minutes. "Already on it, Mom. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we figure out exactly what your son has been up to." But sleep was impossible. I sat in Thomas's old recliner, the one I'd kept in the living room because sitting in it made me feel less alone, and thought about the family I'd raised. 3 children, each so different. Claire with her fierce loyalty and quick temper. Michael with his protective nature and technical skills. And Daniel, my firstborn, who I'd thought had inherited the best qualities of both his parents but who'd apparently learned only how to manipulate and deceive. Where had I gone wrong? What had I missed in raising him that led to this betrayal? Or was this something that had nothing to do with how he was raised and everything to do with choices he'd made as an adult, with values he'd developed on his own, with greed that had overridden any sense of filial duty or basic human decency? The medical alert pendant around my neck suddenly felt like a collar, a tracking device, a symbol of my son's supposed care that had really been about control. I reached up to remove it, then stopped. If Daniel was monitoring the system, if he could tell when I took it off, I didn't want to alert him that I was becoming suspicious. Better to wear it, to act normal, to let him think his plan was still working while I built my case against him. The next morning, Michael arrived early with a friend who worked in information security. They spent 3 hours examining the medical alert system, checking its connectivity, analyzing its data transmission. What they found confirmed my worst fears and revealed a level of premeditation that made the property theft seem almost simple by comparison. "Mom, this isn't a standard medical alert system," Michael said, his face grim as he showed me data on his laptop. "It's been modified. The audio monitoring isn't just for emergency response. It's recording continuously and uploading to a private server. Daniel has been listening to everything that happens in this house. Everything." My voice came out as a whisper. "Every conversation, every phone call I've made from the kitchen?" Michael nodded. "Every conversation in any room where the pendant is present. And Mom, the logs show he's been accessing these recordings regularly. Almost daily. He's been actively monitoring you." The violation felt physical, like my home had been invaded, like my privacy had been stripped away. I thought about all the phone calls with Sandra Chun that I'd made from the kitchen, discussing legal strategy, talking about Daniel's theft. He'd heard all of it. He knew I'd discovered what he'd done. He knew I was building a case against him. And he'd said nothing, pretending everything was normal while gathering information to use against me. "There's more," Michael's friend said quietly. "The system also has location tracking enabled. If you've worn that pendant outside the house, Daniel's been tracking your movements. He knows you went to a lawyer's office last week. He knows you've been to the bank. He knows everywhere you've gone." I sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Daniel's betrayal. This wasn't just about stealing property. It was about total surveillance, about controlling and monitoring my every move, about treating me not like his mother but like a target, a mark, someone whose assets he was systematically acquiring while ensuring she had no privacy, no autonomy, no ability to fight back without him knowing. Can you disable it without him knowing? I asked. Can we turn off the recording function but make it look like it's still working? Michael and his friend exchanged glances. We can do better than that, Michael said with a grim smile. We can leave it active but feed it false information. Make Daniel think he's still monitoring you while you're actually having private conversations he can't hear. And Mom, we're going to use his own surveillance system against him. Over the next week, we created what Michael called a counter-surveillance operation. The medical alert system continued running, but Michael's friend modified it so that certain conversations were scrambled before being uploaded to Daniel's server. Other conversations, ones we carefully scripted, were allowed through clean and clear, designed to mislead Daniel about our plans and intentions. In the meantime, Sanderson was building a legal case that was far more comprehensive than just the property theft. With evidence of the surveillance system, proof that Daniel had been monitoring my private communications with my attorney, documentation of his systematic abuse of power of attorney privileges, she believed we could not only recover my house but potentially pursue criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. But before we moved forward with any legal action, I wanted to understand one thing. I wanted to know if Daniel had acted alone or if there were others involved. Patricia, his wife, seemed too savvy about the vacation condo purchase to be ignorant of where the money was coming from. And there'd been that anonymous tip to Sanderson about the deed transfer. Someone had wanted me to know what Daniel had done. Someone who'd felt guilty or angry enough to reach out but not brave enough to identify themselves. The answer came from an unexpected source. One afternoon there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Patricia standing on my porch, looking nothing like the polished country club woman I'd seen at family gatherings. She looked tired, scared, and much younger than her 45 years. Eleanor, can I come in? We need to talk. I almost said no. This woman had benefited from my son's theft, had apparently been planning how to spend money stolen from me. But something in her expression, some genuine distress, made me step aside and let her enter. We sat in my living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us until Patricia finally spoke. I was the one who contacted the lawyer. I sent the anonymous tip to Sanderson about the quitclaim deed. Why? The word came out harsher than I'd intended. Why tell me but not identify yourself? Why help me but not be honest about it? Patricia's eyes filled with tears. 'Cause I was afraid. Because Daniel has been, Eleanor, I don't even know how to explain this. He's changed over the past 2 years. He's become obsessed with money, with status, with appearing successful. That condo in Vale, it's not just a vacation home. It's his way of proving to his pharmaceutical company colleagues that he's made it, that he's as wealthy as they are. So he stole my house to fund his ego? Patricia shook her head. It's worse than that. The condo is just the beginning. Daniel's been talking about early retirement, about building an investment portfolio she paused, using assets he said would be available soon. Eleanor, I think he's planning to sell your house and use the proceeds as seed money for real estate investments. My own home reduced to seed money. The phrase would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Patricia continued, her words tumbling out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for too long. I didn't know about the medical alert system modifications until last month. I found Daniel in his study late one night listening to recordings. Recordings of you talking to Claire, talking to Michael, talking to yourself when you thought you were alone in the house. I confronted him about it and he said he was protecting his interests, making sure you weren't planning to cut him out of your will or give away assets to your other children. I stared at Patricia, trying to process what she was telling me. The woman sitting across from me had known about Daniel's surveillance for weeks and said nothing directly to me. She'd sent an anonymous tip instead of having the courage to tell me face to face that my son was monitoring my every conversation, tracking my movements, treating me like a criminal under investigation rather than the mother who'd raised him. And you waited until now to tell me this? My voice was steadier than I felt. You've known for weeks that Daniel was listening to my private conversations, that he stole my house, and you sent an anonymous email instead of picking up the phone? Patricia's face crumpled. I know how it sounds. I know I should have done more, should have come to you immediately. But Eleanor, you have to understand what I'm dealing with. Daniel isn't the man you think he is anymore. He's not even the man I married. Over the past 2 years, something in him has shifted. He's become calculating in a way that frightens me. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, tapping at the screen before turning it toward me. On the display was a series of text messages between her and Daniel from the previous month. I read them with growing horror, each message revealing more about the man my son had become. From Patricia. I don't feel comfortable with you monitoring your mother this way. It feels wrong, invasive. From Daniel. She's 72 years old. She doesn't understand what's best for her anymore. Someone needs to make sure she's not being taken advantage of by gold diggers or making poor financial decisions. This is for her own protection. From Patricia. Protection? Daniel, you transferred her house into your name. How is that protecting her? From Daniel. That house is my inheritance. I'm just securing it now before she does something foolish with it. She doesn't need to own property at her age. It's too much responsibility. She should be in assisted living anyway. From Patricia. She's completely capable of living independently. Your mother is sharper than most people half her age. From Daniel. You don't see what I see. The small mistakes, the forgetfulness, the confusion. It's starting, Patricia. In another year or two, she'll need full-time care. I'm planning ahead. When the time comes to sell the house and move her into a facility, everything will already be in place. No messy legal battles, no interference from Claire or Michael. I handed the phone back to Patricia, my hands shaking. He's been planning this for years. The medical alert system, the power of attorney documents transferring the deed, all of it was building toward putting me in a nursing home and selling my house out from under me. Patricia nodded miserably. There's more. Daniel's been in contact with several assisted living facilities in the area. He's been getting pricing information, discussing what he calls your inevitable decline. Eleanor, he's created this entire narrative in his head, where you're losing your faculties, and he's the dutiful son stepping in to handle everything. But it's not true. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you can see you're completely competent. Then why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you tell him he was wrong, that he was lying to himself and everyone else? I tried. God knows I tried. But Daniel doesn't listen anymore. He's surrounded himself with people at work who reinforce his worldview, pharmaceutical sales colleagues who brag about putting their aging parents in facilities and taking over their assets. It's become this toxic competition about who can secure their inheritance first, who can maintain the lifestyle they think they deserve. And Daniel's gotten caught up in it completely. Patricia leaned forward, her expression urgent. Eleanor, there's something else you need to know. Daniel's been having financial problems. His company restructured 6 months ago and his territory was reduced. His commissions have dropped by almost 40%. That Vale condo I posted about? We can't actually afford it. Daniel's been taking out loans against the value of your house, using the deed transfer to secure credit lines. He's already borrowed nearly $200,000. The room tilted. Daniel hadn't just stolen my house. He'd been using it as collateral, racking up debts that I would somehow be responsible for even though I'd never agreed to any of it. If those loans defaulted, if Daniel couldn't pay them back, the lenders would come after the property. My home of 47 years would be seized to pay for my son's failed attempt to maintain an image of wealth he didn't actually possess. Does he know you're here? Does he know you're telling me this? Patricia shook her head quickly. He thinks I'm at a charity luncheon. Eleanor, I'm taking a huge risk coming here. If Daniel finds out, if he discovers I've betrayed his confidence, I don't know what he'll do. Our marriage is already hanging by a thread. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. What he's doing is wrong. It's elder abuse, and I can't be complicit in it any longer. I studied Patricia's face, looking for signs of deception, but all I saw was genuine distress. Whatever else she might be, she seemed to be telling the truth now. The question was whether I could trust her moving forward or if this confession was just another manipulation, another way for Daniel to control the situation by appearing to have an ally in his camp who was actually feeding me information he wanted me to have. Patricia, I need to ask you something and I need complete honesty. Do you benefit financially from what Daniel's done? Is your name on any of these loans or credit lines? She met my eyes directly. No. Daniel's been very careful to keep everything in his name only. I think he knew I'd object if I was directly involved. But Eleanor, I won't pretend I didn't benefit indirectly. The lifestyle we've been maintaining, the private schools for the boys, the country club membership, the new cars, a lot of that was funded by credit extended against your property. I didn't ask enough questions about where the money was coming from because I didn't want to know. That makes me complicit too. At least she was being honest about that. It didn't absolve her of guilt, but it gave me a clearer picture of the situation. Daniel had orchestrated everything carefully, keeping his wife just distant enough from the direct fraud that she could claim ignorance while still enjoying the benefits. What do you want from me now? I asked. Why come forward now instead of last week or last month? What changed? Patricia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Last night, Daniel was on the phone with someone. Another call he thought I couldn't hear. He was discussing selling the house within the next 60 days. He said he'd already spoken to a real estate agent about listing price, about staging the property. Eleanor, he's planning to sell your home while you're still living in it. He's going to force you out within 2 months. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just stealing my property, not just using it as collateral for loans, but actively planning to displace me, to make me homeless in my 70s so he could cash out and save himself from his own financial mistakes. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a calculated destruction of everything I'd built, everyone I'd been. I need copies of everything you have, I said, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Those text messages, any emails about the loans or the assisted living facilities, any documentation about Daniel's financial problems. I need all of it from my attorney. Patricia nodded, already pulling up files on her phone. I've been saving everything for the past month. I think part of me knew it would come to this, that I'd eventually have to choose between protecting Daniel and doing what was right. I'll send it all to you right now. What's your email address? After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal, feeling simultaneously empowered and devastated. Empowered because I now had concrete proof of Daniel's plans, documentation that would strengthen my legal case significantly. Devastated because there was no longer any way to pretend this was a misunderstanding or a mistake. Daniel had deliberately, methodically, maliciously set out to destroy my independence and steal my security. And he'd done it all while playing the role of concerned son, visiting regularly, calling to check on me, installing that damned medical alert system that turned my home into a surveillance operation. I called Sandra Chun immediately and forwarded her everything Patricia had sent. Within an hour, Sandra called back, her voice carrying an edge of anger I hadn't heard before. Mrs. Walsh, this changes everything. With this evidence, we're not just looking at a civil case for property fraud. This could potentially be criminal elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft for the unauthorized loans. I'm going to contact the district attorney's office. This level of premeditation and manipulation they'll want to investigate. I don't want my son to go to jail, I heard myself saying, surprised by the words even as they left my mouth. Despite everything, despite his complete betrayal, the instinct to protect him was still there, buried under the anger but present nonetheless. Sandra's response was gentle but firm. Mrs. Walsh, I understand. He's your son. But you need to understand the full scope of what he's done. He hasn't just stolen your property. He's taken out massive loans in your name essentially, secured by a house he fraudulently obtained. When those loans come due, if he can't pay them, the lenders will pursue the property. You could lose your home not just to Daniel but to the banks he's borrowed from. This isn't just about punishing him. It's about protecting yourself from financial ruin. She was right, of course. This had gone far beyond a family dispute. Daniel had created a legal and financial mess that threatened my security in ways I was only beginning to understand. The house Thomas and I had bought with our modest savings, that we'd paid off slowly over 30 years while raising our children, that represented everything we'd worked for and sacrificed for. It was now encumbered by debts I'd never agreed to, secured by a transfer I'd been tricked into authorizing. What do we do next? I asked, pushing aside my complicated feelings about Daniel's potential legal consequences. How do we fix this? First, we file an emergency motion to reverse the deed transfer and place a restraining order preventing any sale of the property. Second, we notify the lenders that the loans were secured through fraudulent means and that you're disputing your liability. Third, we pursue a full accounting of any other financial instruments Daniel may have executed using his power of attorney. And fourth, we immediately revoke all powers of attorney, medical directives, and any other legal authority Daniel has over your affairs. The process Sandra outlined would take months, possibly years. It would be expensive, emotionally draining, and would almost certainly destroy whatever remained of my relationship with Daniel. But what choice did I have? The alternative was to accept my own dispossession, to let my son steal everything I had while I passively waited for him to decide my future. Do it, I said. File everything. Today. That afternoon, Claire and Michael came over for an emergency family meeting. I told them about Patricia's visit, about the loans Daniel had taken out, about his plans to sell the house within 60 days. Michael's reaction was immediate and violent, not physically but emotionally. He wanted to confront Daniel immediately, to make him confess, to force him to reverse everything he'd done. Claire was more strategic. We need to document everything first, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. If we confront him now, he'll just deny it or find a way to hide evidence. We need to let him think his plan is still working while we build an airtight case. She was right, though it went against every instinct I had. The idea of pretending everything was normal, of answering Daniel's phone calls and accepting his visits while knowing what he'd done, it felt like a betrayal of my own dignity. But dignity wouldn't protect my house or recover the equity Daniel had already borrowed against. That's not all we need to do, Michael added. We need to figure out who else knows about this. Patricia helped, but she was part of it for months before she came forward. Who else in Daniel's life knew what he was doing and said nothing? The question hung in the air like an accusation. How many people had known that Daniel was defrauding his elderly mother? His colleagues at work who'd apparently encouraged this behavior? The real estate agent he'd contacted about selling the house? The loan officers who'd extended credit based on a fraudulently obtained deed? The notary who'd witnessed my signature on documents I didn't understand? I want to know about that notary, I said suddenly. The person who notarized the quitclaim deed. Sandra said it was done on January 15th at Daniel's house during the birthday party. Who was it? Did they verify my identity? Did they make sure I understood what I was signing? Michael pulled out his laptop. Give me a minute. If the deed is public record, the notary's information should be on it. He typed rapidly, navigating to the county recorder's website, pulling up the document in question. Got it. The notary was someone named Jessica Brennan. Her commission number and seal are right here. Do you recognize that name, Mom? Claire asked. Is she someone Daniel knows personally? I shook my head. I'd never heard the name before. But if she notarized a document at Daniel's house during a family party, she must have some connection to him. Notaries don't just randomly show up at birthday celebrations. Michael was already running searches on his laptop. Found her. Jessica Brennan, age 32, works at a legal document preparation service downtown. Her LinkedIn shows she's connected to Patricia. They're both in the same women's business networking group. So Patricia definitely knew about the deed transfer from the beginning, Claire said grimly. She had to have known if her networking contact was the one who notarized it. I thought about Patricia's tearful confession, her claims that she'd only recently discovered the extent of Daniel's plans. But if her own business contact had been the notary, she'd known from day one exactly what document I was signing. Her anonymous tip to Sandra Chun hadn't been about guilty conscience. It had been about protecting herself, about creating distance between herself and Daniel's fraud, when she realized how serious the legal consequences might be. I'm calling Sandra again, I said, reaching for my phone. She needs to know about this connection. If the notary was Patricia's contact and Patricia's text messages show she knew the deed transfer was wrong, that could prove the whole thing was a conspiracy. Over the next week, Sandra's investigation uncovered layers of deception I'd never imagined. Jessica Brennan, the notary, had a history of document fraud allegations in another county, though she'd never been formally charged. She'd moved to our area 2 years ago and had quickly become known among certain circles as someone who would notarize documents without asking too many questions, who would backdate forms if needed, who would be flexible about verification requirements for the right price. Daniel had paid her $1,500 to come to his house and notarize the quitclaim deed, more than 10 times the normal fee for such a service. The excessive payment, Sandra explained, was essentially a bribe to ensure Jessica didn't probe too deeply into whether I understood what I was signing, whether I'd had independent legal counsel, whether the transaction was legitimate. But the most damning discovery came from the recordings on Daniel's surveillance system. Michael's security expert friend had managed to extract the full archive of audio files Daniel had collected over the months since installing the medical alert system. Among them were recordings of phone calls I'd made to my sister in Florida, conversations where I'd explicitly talked about wanting to leave the house to all three of my children equally, about making sure none of them felt slighted in my will. Those recordings proved Daniel knew my intentions for the property. He'd heard me say multiple times that I wanted my estate divided fairly among my children. Yet he'd gone ahead with transferring the deed anyway, knowing it violated my clearly expressed wishes. That evidence of intent, Sandra said, would be crucial in proving this wasn't just a misunderstanding but deliberate fraud. The confrontation with Daniel came sooner than we'd planned. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Patricia's confession, Daniel showed up at my house unannounced. I was in the kitchen having coffee with Claire when I heard his key in the lock, heard him calling out a cheerful greeting as he let himself in. He stopped short when he saw Claire and me sitting at the table, our expressions carefully neutral. Something in the atmosphere must have alerted him because his smile faded and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Morning, Mom." "Claire. I didn't know you'd be here," he said to his sister, his tone casual but wary. "We're having coffee," Claire replied evenly. "Want to join us?" Daniel hesitated, clearly sensing a trap but unable to identify what it might be. "Sure. Just let me grab a cup." As he moved around my kitchen, acting like he owned the place, which legally he apparently did, I felt a surge of rage so intense I had to grip my coffee mug to keep my hands from shaking. This man had stolen my home, had monitored my every conversation, had planned to displace me and sell my property, and he had the audacity to walk into my house using his own key as if nothing had changed. "Daniel, we need to talk," I said once he'd sat down at the table. "It's about the house." His expression didn't change, but I saw his grip tighten on his mug. "What about the house?" "About the fact that you transferred the deed into your name without telling me what I was signing. About the loans you've taken out using my property as collateral. About your plan to sell the house within the next 60 days while I'm still living here." For a long moment Daniel said nothing. He looked at me, then at Claire, then back at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, reasonable, the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a confused child. "Mom, I don't know where you're getting this information, but you've been misled. Yes, I helped you reorganize some of your paperwork last winter. We talked about it extensively. You were worried about estate taxes, about making sure the house would transfer smoothly to your children when the time came. The deed transfer was your idea." "That's a lie," Claire interjected sharply. "Mom never suggested any such thing." Daniel didn't even look at her. "Mom, you're 72 years old. I know it's hard to admit, but your memory isn't what it used to be. We've all noticed it. The repeated questions, the confusion about dates, the forgetfulness. That's why I've been helping you manage your affairs. That's why I installed the medical alert system. You needed someone to look out for you. I'm not confused, Daniel. I'm not forgetful. And I certainly didn't agree to transfer my house to you so you could borrow $200,000 against it and buy a vacation condo in Vail." His face went very still. "Who told you about the condo? Does it matter? What matters is that you stole my property through fraud and deception. What matters is that you've been surveilling me through that medical alert system, recording my private conversations, tracking my movements. What matters is that you're planning to sell my home and force me into assisted living, so you can use the proceeds for your own financial benefit." Daniel set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. "Mom, I think you need to see a doctor. These accusations, this paranoia, it's not normal. You're clearly having some kind of episode." It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. The concerned son worried about his aging mother's mental deterioration. The reasonable adult suggesting medical intervention. If I hadn't had evidence, if I hadn't known the truth, I might have started doubting myself. But I did have evidence. And I was done being manipulated. Claire pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. "I've been recording this conversation, Daniel. Everything you just said about Mom being confused and forgetful, about her memory problems and paranoia. I'll record it. And it's going straight to her attorney as evidence that you're trying to gaslight her into accepting your theft of her property." Daniel's reasonable mask slipped. His face flushed dark red and his jaw clenched. "You have no right to record me without my consent. Actually, in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation, and that party is me, Claire said coolly. And even if it weren't legal, it's nothing compared to what you've been doing. Months of illegal surveillance, recording Mom's private conversations without her knowledge or consent. You want to talk about violations of privacy? Let's have that conversation with the police. Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. I've done nothing but try to help you, Mom. I've managed your finances, maintained your property, made sure you were safe. And this is how you repay me? By siding with Claire against me? By making wild accusations? You transferred my house into your name, I said quietly. You borrowed $200,000 against property that wasn't yours. You installed surveillance equipment in my home. Those aren't wild accusations, Daniel. Those are facts. And you're going to answer for them. For the first time, I saw real fear in my son's eyes. He looked at me, then at Claire, and seemed to realize that his careful plans had unraveled completely. The loving son act wasn't working anymore. The gaslighting about my supposed cognitive decline wasn't convincing anyone. He'd been caught and he knew it. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. I want you to transfer the deed back to me immediately. I want you to take responsibility for the loans you fraudulently obtained and ensure they don't affect my property. I want you to remove that surveillance system from my house. And I want you to stay away from me until I decide whether I can ever forgive what you've done. Daniel laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You think it's that simple? You think I can just undo everything? Mom, those loans are already spent. The money's gone. And even if I wanted to transfer the deed back, the property's encumbered now. There are liens against it. You can't just make this go away. Then you'll have to deal with the legal consequences, Claire said. Because Mom's attorney is filing criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. You'll be explaining all of this to a judge and possibly a jury. Daniel's face went pale. You wouldn't do that. I'm your son. You wouldn't send me to prison. I looked at him, this man who'd been the first child I'd held in my arms 48 years ago, who I'd rocked to sleep through countless nights, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose triumphs I'd celebrated. I tried to find some trace of that boy in the cold-eyed stranger standing in my kitchen, but he was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed. Maybe I'd just seen what I wanted to see, believed what I wanted to believe about the child I'd raised. You did this to yourself, Daniel. Every choice you made, every lie you told, every document you manipulated, that was you. Not me. You chose to betray my trust. You chose to steal from me. You chose to treat me not as your mother but as an asset to be exploited. So yes, if criminal charges are what it takes to protect myself and recover what you've stolen, then that's what will happen. Daniel left without another word, his footsteps heavy on the porch stairs. Through the window, I watched him sit in his expensive car for several minutes, his head in his hands before finally driving away. I felt no satisfaction in his defeat, no triumph in having confronted him. Just a deep, exhausting sadness for everything that had been lost. The legal proceedings took 9 months to resolve completely. Sandra Chun proved to be worth every penny I paid her, methodically dismantling Daniel's fraud piece by piece. The quitclaim deed was invalidated based on evidence that I'd been deliberately misled about what I was signing. The notary, Jessica Brennan, lost her commission and faced separate fraud charges after investigators discovered she'd engaged in similar schemes with other elderly clients. The loans Daniel had taken out were more complicated. The banks initially tried to hold me responsible, arguing that the deed transfer had been properly recorded and they'd extended credit in good faith. But Sandra demonstrated that the lenders had failed to conduct adequate due diligence, that the excessive loan amounts relative to Daniel's income should have raised red flags, that the speed with which the loans were approved suggested they deliberately overlooked obvious warning signs. Eventually, all 3 lenders agreed to settlements that released my property from the liens in exchange for Daniel personally guaranteeing the debt. He'd be paying those loans back for the next 20 years at least. The vacation condo in Vail never materialized. Instead, Daniel and Patricia had to sell their primary home and move into a much smaller place to manage the debt he'd accumulated. Patricia filed for divorce 6 months into the legal battle. She'd cooperated fully with investigators, providing evidence that helped establish the timeline and intent behind Daniel's actions. In exchange, she'd been granted immunity from prosecution and had been able to keep some assets in the divorce settlement. The last I heard, she'd moved to another state with the boys and was rebuilding her life far away from the wreckage of her marriage. As for Daniel himself, he avoided prison but just barely. He pled guilty to reduced charges of financial exploitation of an elderly person and fraud. His sentence included 5 years probation, mandatory restitution, and 200 hours of community service. He also lost his job in pharmaceutical sales once his conviction became public record. Last I heard from Michael, Daniel was working as a sales associate at a big box hardware store, making a fraction of his former salary while most of it went to loan payments and restitution. The surveillance system was removed from my house the day after our confrontation. Michael's friend made sure every component was extracted, every wire disconnected, every trace of Daniel's monitoring eliminated. I had the locks changed that same week, ensuring Daniel could never again let himself into my home uninvited. The medical alert pendant went into a drawer, a reminder of how love could be weaponized, how concern could mask control. Claire and Michael became more present in my life after everything came to light. Not because they felt obligated, but because we'd all learned how quickly family bonds could fracture, how easily trust could be destroyed. We had Sunday dinners most weeks, just the three of us and sometimes their families, rebuilding connections that had become strained by years of busy lives and competing priorities. Claire apologized repeatedly for not seeing what Daniel was doing sooner, for not recognizing the warning signs. But how could she have known? Daniel had been so careful, so methodical in his manipulation. He'd cultivated the image of the responsible oldest child, while systematically betraying everything that role should have meant. Michael struggled more visibly with what had happened. He'd looked up to Daniel his entire life, had modeled his own approach to family responsibility after his older brother's example. Learning that it had all been performance, that Daniel's attentiveness had been about positioning himself to steal rather than genuine care, it shook Michael's understanding of their family history. We spent many evenings talking through his feelings, helping him separate his own identity from the actions of a brother who'd proven himself unworthy of the admiration he'd received. The most unexpected development came from Sandra Chen. After the legal battle concluded, she asked if I'd be willing to share my story with other clients and advocacy groups. Elder financial abuse was epidemic, she explained, but victims often remained silent out of shame or misplaced family loyalty. My willingness to fight back, to hold my son accountable despite the personal cost, could help others recognize and resist similar exploitation. I agreed, though it wasn't easy. Speaking publicly about Daniel's betrayal meant admitting to rooms full of strangers that my own child had valued money over his relationship with me, that I'd been foolish enough to trust blindly, that my family had been fractured beyond repair. But with each presentation, each support group meeting, I met other elderly people who'd experienced similar betrayals. Adult children who'd stolen inheritances, forged signatures, manipulated confused parents into signing away their assets. One woman told me her daughter had been slowly emptying her bank accounts for 3 years before she'd noticed. Another man described how his son had taken out a reverse mortgage on his home without his knowledge. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they were also empowering. None of us were alone in this experience. We'd all trusted the wrong people and paid devastating prices for that trust. Through this advocacy work, I met Richard Thornton. He was 75, a retired accountant whose own daughter had embezzled nearly $200,000 from him over a 5-year period. Unlike me, he'd chosen not to press criminal charges, but his daughter had never apologized or acknowledged what she'd done. She simply stopped speaking to him after he discovered the theft, leaving him to grieve both the financial loss and the relationship he'd thought they had. Richard and I became friends first, bonding over our shared experiences of family betrayal and the complicated emotions that came with it. The guilt over somehow failing our children as parents, the anger at having been used so callously, the grief for relationships that could never be repaired, but also the resilience we discovered in ourselves, the strength we hadn't known we possessed until we'd been forced to fight for our own survival. Our friendship gradually became something more. Not a grand romance, we were both too old and too scarred for that kind of passion, but a comfortable companionship built on mutual understanding and respect. Someone who knew my whole story and didn't judge me for it. Someone who understood that healing from family betrayal was a process, not an event, and who had patience for the bad days when grief overwhelmed resilience. On my 74th birthday, Richard and I took a trip to the coast, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for during my marriage to Thomas. We walked on the beach, ate fresh seafood, watched the sunset over the Pacific. It was peaceful in a way my life hadn't been for years, maybe ever. No surveillance, no hidden agendas, no one waiting to betray my trust. I thought about Daniel often during that trip. Wondered if he ever reflected on what he'd destroyed, if he understood that the money he'd tried to steal was nothing compared to what he'd actually lost. He'd traded a relationship with his mother, his siblings, his own children who now knew what he'd done, for a grab at wealth that had evaporated the moment he'd been caught. I'd offered him the chance to apologize multiple times through intermediaries. Sandra had made it clear that while nothing could undo the legal consequences, a genuine expression of remorse might open the door to some kind of reconciliation eventually. But Daniel had never apologized. Not once. He'd maintained to anyone who would listen that he'd been trying to help me, that I'd been confused, that Claire and Michael had turned me against him. His inability to accept responsibility was perhaps his greatest betrayal. Not the theft, not the surveillance, but his refusal to acknowledge that he'd done anything wrong. That refusal told me everything I needed to know about who Daniel really was underneath the mask he'd worn for so many years. Claire suggested once that I should feel guilty about Daniel's reduced circumstances, about the fact that my insistence on legal consequences had resulted in his financial ruin. But I didn't. He'd made his choices knowing the potential consequences. He'd gambled that I would never discover what he'd done, or that if I did, I'd be too intimidated or too loyal to fight back. He'd lost that gamble, and the price he paid was entirely of his own making. The house felt different now, though nothing physical had changed. The walls still held the same family photos, the room still contained the furniture Thomas and I had collected over decades. But the meaning had shifted. It was no longer just the house where I'd raised my children. It was the house I'd fought to keep, the symbol of my refusal to be victimized, the proof that even at 74, I was capable of protecting myself and demanding justice. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sat in Thomas's old recliner and imagined what he would have said about everything that had happened. Thomas had adored Daniel, had been so proud of his oldest son's success, his confidence, his seeming competence. Would he have believed Daniel capable of such calculated cruelty? Or would he have made excuses, convinced himself there'd been some misunderstanding? I like to think Thomas would have stood by me, would have been as outraged by Daniel's actions as Claire and Michael had been. But honestly, I'd never know. Thomas had been gone for 6 years, spared the knowledge that the son he'd raised with such high hopes had become someone capable of stealing from his own mother. The medical alert pendant sat in my desk drawer, a physical reminder of how trust could be corrupted. I'd gotten a different emergency response system eventually, one from a company with no connection to Daniel, one that was monitored by professionals with no personal stake in my life. But I'd kept the original pendant as evidence, as a tangible representation of what had happened. Sometimes I took it out and looked at it, remembering how I'd worn it, believing it represented my son's love and concern, never suspecting it was actually a surveillance device designed to monitor and control me. Richard understood why I kept it. He had his own artifacts from his daughter's betrayal, documents and records he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy. We were both carrying these wounds into whatever future remained to us, scars that had healed but would never fully disappear. The difference was that we weren't carrying them alone anymore. A year and a half after confronting Daniel, I received a letter from him. It came to my house with no return address, just his familiar handwriting on the envelope. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won out. Inside was a single page, his words cramped and angry. He wrote that I'd destroyed his life, that I'd turned his siblings against him, that I'd chosen money over family. He claimed he'd only been trying to help, to prepare for my inevitable decline, to ensure I'd be taken care of in my old age. He accused me of being selfish, of not appreciating his sacrifices, of believing lies that Claire and Michael had told about him. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd actually done, no recognition that his actions had been wrong. I read the letter once, then put it in the file with all the other legal documents from the case. It would go to Sandra if Daniel violated his probation or attempted any further contact. But mostly, it served as confirmation that I'd made the right choice in cutting him out of my life. This was who Daniel was, someone who could steal everything from his mother and still position himself as the victim. Claire wanted to know if I felt sad after reading the letter, if part of me wished for reconciliation despite everything. The answer was complicated. I mourned the son I'd thought I had, the relationship I believed we shared. But that son, that relationship, they'd never really existed. I'd been mourning a fiction for 18 months now. Daniel's letter didn't change that. If anything, it provided closure, proof that the person I'd been grieving had never been real. Life moved forward because it had no choice. I celebrated birthdays and holidays with Claire and Michael and their families. I continued my advocacy work with Sandra's organization, helping other elderly people recognize and resist financial exploitation. I traveled with Richard, finally seeing places Thomas and I had always talked about visiting but never made time for. I lived fully and independently, in the house that was mine again, secured by my own strength and determination. And through it all, I carried the knowledge that I'd survived my son's betrayal not by being weak or passive, but by fighting back with every tool available to me. I'd refused to accept the role Daniel had tried to force me into, the confused elderly woman who needed others to make decisions for her. I'd proven that age didn't equal helplessness, that trust betrayed could be answered with strength, that family loyalty didn't require accepting abuse. The medical alert pendant stayed in its drawer, a reminder of where I'd been. But it no longer defined where I was going. I was Eleanor Walsh, 74 years old, living independently in the home I'd fought to keep, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being rather than my assets. I'd lost a son but gained something more valuable, the absolute certainty that I could protect myself, that I was stronger than anyone who tried to exploit me. That betrayal didn't have to mean defeat. And that knowledge, hard-won and painful as it was, had given me a kind of freedom I'd never experienced before. The freedom to trust myself completely, to make my own decisions without second-guessing, to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than obligation or fear. Daniel had tried to take everything from me, but in the end what he'd actually done was teach me exactly how strong I could be when everything depended on it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.